First sip hits the back of the throat. Within 4 minutes, the molecule crosses the blood-brain barrier. Within 20, the fog lifts. The body feels like it woke up for the second time. You have been drinking it for 30 years, and the assumption has been identical for all 30. Coffee gives you energy. Coffee gives you nothing. It blocks the signal that tells you how tired you are. The molecule in the cup is shaped like the molecule your brain uses to track how long you have been awake. Similar enough to occupy the receptor, different enough to leave the receptor silent. The drowsiness signal cannot get through. The drowsiness molecule keeps accumulating behind the blocked receptor, hour after hour, the total growing while you feel nothing. When the caffeine clears, the accumulated signal floods through simultaneously, and the crash arrives because 8 hours of drowsiness data hit the receptors in minutes. The coffee borrowed wakefulness from the afternoon and repaid it with interest. 6 systems responded to one molecule simultaneously. The receptors that track wakefulness were blocked. The cortisol pathway that drives morning alertness was compounded. The stomach lining received acid on a thinned barrier. The gut's cleaning wave was amplified through a hormone. The dopamine receptors that drive motivation were disinhibited, and the liver began a clearance that would take 10 to 12 hours to complete. 1 cup. 6 systems. And the only one that changed permanently was the receptor count. The brain adjusted to ensure the next cup would be slightly less effective than the last. What is the drowsiness signal, and how does caffeine block it? Adenosine, a molecule your brain produces as a byproduct of energy consumption during every waking hour. Every time a neuron fires, every time a cell burns adenosine triphosphate for fuel, the spent molecule leaves adenosine behind as a residue. The residue accumulates. By the time you have been awake for 16 hours, the concentration of adenosine in your brain has risen measurably, and the receptors that detect it are registering a signal that increases with every hour of wakefulness. You are tired. The heaviness behind the eyes at 10 in the evening. The difficulty sustaining a thought at 11. The moment the book falls from your hands because your grip relaxed without your permission. Each is the adenosine level crossing a higher threshold. The tiredness is a chemical measurement, as objective as a blood glucose reading, as quantifiable as blood pressure. Adenosine is the brain's clock for time awake, and the clock runs from the moment you open your eyes until the moment sleep clears it. During sleep, the brain metabolizes the accumulated adenosine, resetting the clock to near zero by morning. The first hour of wakefulness rebuilds the signal from the cleared baseline. By hour 4, the adenosine level has risen enough that you can feel a subtle decline in sharpness, the edge that was effortless at 8 in the morning requiring slightly more effort by noon. By hour 12, the signal is strong enough that concentration requires active resistance. By hour 16, the signal dominates. The book falls, the eyelids close, the body demands the sleep that will clear the adenosine and reset the clock for the next day. The entire arc of alertness across your waking day traces this single molecule's concentration rising from the cleared morning baseline toward the evening threshold that drives you to bed. 2 receptor subtypes read the signal. A1 receptors sit on neurons throughout the cortex in the basal forebrain, and when adenosine binds them, the neuron's firing rate decreases. Fewer neurons firing means less cortical activation, less arousal, more drowsiness. A2A receptors sit in the arousal circuits that maintain wakefulness, and when adenosine binds them, those circuits quiet down. Both receptor types read one molecule. Both produce one direction. As adenosine rises across the day, the brain gradually dials down its own activity, preparing the body for the sleep, the evening routine discussion described as the destination the adenosine buildup drives toward. Caffeine's molecular structure mimics adenosine closely enough to fit inside the binding site of both receptor types. The caffeine molecule slides into the receptor the way a wrong key slides into a lock. It fits the opening, it occupies the space, but it does not turn the mechanism. The receptor is physically occupied by a molecule that produces no signal. Competitive antagonism, the real ligand, adenosine, arrives at the receptor and finds it already taken. The adenosine cannot bind. The drowsiness signal cannot register. You experience the blocked signal as added energy because the absence of drowsiness feels identical to the presence of alertness. Close your eyes and imagine the difference between a room that is bright and a room where the dimmer was blocked from turning down. The light level is identical. The mechanism is opposite. One added light, one prevented darkness. Coffee prevents darkness. Nothing was added. A signal was suppressed. Suppression does not stop the production. Adenosine continues accumulating in the extracellular space at the rate it would have accumulated without the coffee. Every neuron still firing, every cell still burning fuel, every hour still adding its adenosine residue to the growing pool. The pool rises behind a locked door. The drowsiness signal knocks. The caffeine is the deadbolt. The knocking does not stop. It accumulates. When the deadbolt clears, 8 hours of knocking comes through simultaneously. Competitive antagonism at the adenosine receptor is the central pharmacology of coffee, with caffeine binding both A1 and A2A subtypes as a reversible antagonist, with no intrinsic activity. Fred Holm and colleagues established this mechanism in pharmacological reviews. The binding is reversible. The caffeine will leave. The question is when it leaves, because the timing of the departure determines whether the accumulated drowsiness crashes your afternoon or collapses your sleep. I experienced the afternoon crash differently the week the receptor physics replaced the word energy in my understanding of coffee. The crash at 2 in the afternoon was not a loss of something the coffee gave me. It was the arrival of something the coffee had been hiding. 8 hours of adenosine accumulation landing on receptors that were suddenly unoccupied. All at once, the drowsiness signal arriving at its true magnitude for the first time since morning. The crash was the debt. The morning focus was the loan. How long does the deadbolt stay in place? 5 to 6 hours. The half-life of caffeine in most adults. First-order elimination. The liver metabolizes caffeine at a rate proportional to its concentration, clearing half the circulating dose every 5 to 6 hours regardless of the remaining amount. A cup of coffee at 2 in the afternoon. 100% of the caffeine at 2, 50% at 8 in the evening, 25% at 2 in the morning, 12.5% at 8 the next morning. The quarter life, the time to reach 25% is 10 to 12 hours. A 2 o'clock coffee is physiologically present during every hour of that night's sleep. If you drink 2 cups, the arithmetic doubles. 200 milligrams of caffeine at 2 in the afternoon means 100 milligrams at 8, 50 at 2 in the morning, 25 at 8 the next morning. 2 cups means the residual concentration at midnight is equivalent to drinking a full cup at that hour. The half-life does not care how long ago the coffee was consumed. It cares how much was consumed, because the starting dose determines the residual at every subsequent hour on the elimination curve. A single espresso at 30 milligrams affects the curve differently than a large filter coffee at 200. The dose sets the starting point. The half-life sets the slope. The product of the two determines what concentration is still occupying receptors when the lights go out. You fall asleep. Adenosine at 75% unblocked is sufficient for sleep onset. You close your eyes. You lose consciousness. You believe you slept normally. Did the sleep change? Sleep architecture changed. Caffeine at 25% concentration still occupies enough A1 receptors to reduce slow-wave sleep, the deepest phase of the sleep cycle, the phase during which the brain runs its overnight maintenance, lymphatic clearance. The process by which cerebrospinal fluid enters the brain, along arterial walls through channels formed by aquaporin 4 water pores on the astrocyte cells that line the vessels, flushes through the interstitial space carrying accumulated metabolic waste including amyloid beta protein fragments and exits along venous drainage pathways. The clearance system operates at its highest capacity during slow-wave sleep because the interstitial space expands by approximately 60% during deep sleep. Opening the drainage channels, the daytime brain keeps compressed. The hippocampal to cortical memory transfer that consolidates the day's learning also runs exclusively during slow-wave sleep. Slow-wave sleep is when the repair happens. Growth hormone releases in its largest overnight pulse during the first slow-wave cycle, driving tissue repair across every organ. Compress slow-wave sleep and you compress all three: waste clearance, tissue repair, and memory consolidation. Caffeine compresses the repair window. Caffeine consumed 6 hours before bedtime reduced total sleep by approximately 40 minutes and slow-wave sleep by up to 20%. Even when subjects reported no difficulty falling asleep and no subjective sense of disrupted rest. Drake and colleagues measured this in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine. You felt rested. The polysomnography showed compressed deep sleep. The repair window the body depends on was shortened by a cup consumed 8 hours earlier. Morning grogginess that should not be there after a full night, the fog that the next cup of coffee will lift, may partly trace to residual afternoon caffeine, reducing the slow-wave sleep the brain needed to complete its overnight maintenance. The morning coffee may be treating the damage the afternoon coffee caused. The cycle sustains itself. Afternoon coffee compresses overnight repair. Compressed repair produces morning fog. Morning fog demands morning coffee. Morning coffee begins the half-life clock that will deposit residual caffeine into the next night's sleep architecture. The loop runs on a 24-hour cycle that anyone who sleeps fine after afternoon coffee does not recognize because the subjective sleep experience does not reveal the architectural compression the polysomnography would show. Now the receptor is blocked. The half-life is ticking. The accumulated drowsiness will arrive on a predictable curve, but the timing of the first cup determines something else entirely, something that has nothing to do with adenosine and everything to do with a hormone the body was already producing when the coffee arrived. What happens when caffeine arrives during the cortisol peak? Cortisol. Cortisol peaks 30 to 45 minutes after waking in a surge called the cortisol awakening response. The surge is the body's natural alertness driver, the built-in system that transitions you from sleep to functional wakefulness without any external input. Cortisol increases norepinephrine activity in the brain's arousal center, the locus coeruleus, driving up alertness, attention, and readiness. Caffeine, arriving simultaneously, blocks adenosine's dampening of that arousal center. Adenosine normally acts as a brake on norepinephrine release. Caffeine removes the brake. Cortisol presses the accelerator. Both inputs arrive at identical neurons simultaneously, one adding drive and the other removing restraint, and the result is overshoot, more arousal than either system would produce alone. Jitteriness. The racing thoughts. The anxiety some people experience with their first morning cup. The experience is the overshoot, two alertness drivers stacking on one system when either one alone would have been sufficient. The cortisol was already waking you up. The coffee added a second accelerator to a system that was already accelerating. Well, the cortisol interaction reframed my own morning jitteriness as a timing problem rather than a sensitivity problem. The same cup consumed 90 to 120 minutes after waking. As the cortisol peak begins declining, produces smooth, sustained wakefulness because the caffeine substitutes for the waning cortisol rather than stacking on top of it. The cortisol descends. The caffeine ascends. One driver replacing another rather than two drivers compounding. The practical application: if you wake at 6:30, your cortisol peaks at approximately 7 to 7:15. Coffee at 7 stacks on the peak. Coffee at 8:30 arrives as the cortisol begins its descent, substituting smoothly for the waning natural drive. The jitteriness you attributed to too much caffeine may have been too early caffeine, the timing rather than the dose producing the overshoot. Caffeine consumed during elevated cortisol produces amplified arousal compared to caffeine consumed during baseline cortisol, a difference measurable in both heart rate variability and subjective anxiety scores. Lavallo and colleagues documented this in psychosomatic medicine. 2 o'clock crash may carry a second dimension beyond the adenosine debt. Cortisol follows a circadian curve with a natural trough in the early afternoon. The caffeine from the morning cup is declining on its half-life curve at the hour the cortisol is reaching its daily minimum. Two descending curves converging simultaneously. The crash is not just the adenosine flooding through, it is the adenosine flooding through while the cortisol support withdraws simultaneously. Two systems that were propping up your alertness through the morning, both declining in one 90-minute window. The temptation to drink another coffee at this hour is the temptation to reset the deadbolt for another 5-hour cycle, pushing the adenosine debt into the evening and the residual caffeine into the overnight sleep architecture. Each afternoon cup borrows from the night. The debt compounds across every day. The pattern repeats. A week of 2 o'clock coffees means 7 consecutive nights of compressed slow-wave sleep, 7 nights of reduced waste clearance, 7 nights of shortened growth hormone pulses, 7 nights of incomplete memory consolidation. The cumulative maintenance deficit does not announce itself as dramatic sleep failure. It announces itself as gradual cognitive fog. The sense that the sharpness you had at 40 is not quite available at 60. The assumption that the decline is age when part of it may be decades of compressed repair windows from afternoon caffeine that was always still circulating at midnight. The receptor is blocked. The half-life is ticking. The cortisol timing is either compounding or sequencing. 3 physics dimensions of one molecule, and the cup has not reached the stomach yet. What happens below the esophagus activates 2 systems simultaneously, and both respond to caffeine within 30 minutes of the first sip. What does the coffee do in the gut? Caffeine stimulates acid production in the stomach within 15 to 30 minutes. Acid output increases. If you drink coffee first thing in the morning, the acid arrives on a stomach lining that spent the overnight hours at its minimum mucosal thickness, the barrier at its thinnest after a night of fasting without the prostaglandin stimulation that food and water provide. Acid on a thinned barrier. The sequence matters. Water first stimulates the mucosal defense mechanisms, rebuilding the prostaglandin-mediated barrier that protects the stomach lining from its own acid. Coffee first delivers acid onto the overnight thin surface without the buffer. The burning you feel in an empty stomach after the first sip is acid meeting a barrier at its minimum overnight thickness. Food or water consumed before the coffee provides the mechanical and chemical stimulation the lining needs to rebuild its protective layer before the acid arrives. Simultaneously, caffeine stimulates release of melatonin, the hormone the meal's discussion described gating the cleaning wave of the small intestine. The morning bathroom urgency within 20 to 30 minutes of the first cup is phase 3 of the cleaning wave being pharmacologically amplified by caffeine boosting the melatonin signal. The overnight fast was already running the cleaning wave. The coffee amplified the wave's contraction force, pushing material through the ileocecal valve into the colon and triggering the defecation reflex. And then, black coffee versus coffee with cream, fat triggers cholecystokinin, and cholecystokinin suppresses melatonin. Caffeine pushes the cleaning wave forward, cream pulls it back. Black coffee delivers the cleanest melatonin signal. Coffee with cream partially blunts the wave the caffeine amplified. The morning urgency differs between black and cream because 2 hormones are pulling in opposite directions, and the ratio of caffeine-driven melatonin to fat-driven cholecystokinin determines which one wins. The practical implication, if the morning bathroom visit is part of your routine and you rely on it, switching from black to cream may blunt it. If the urgency is uncomfortable and you want to reduce it, cream partially breaks the wave the caffeine accelerated. Gut received the acid and the cleaning wave signal, but the brain receives something else from a single cup, something beyond the alertness the adenosine blockade produced. A shift in how motivated you feel. The motivation is not coming from where you think. Why does coffee make you feel like you can tackle the day? Where does the motivation come from? Dopamine, the neurotransmitter that drives motivation, reward anticipation, and the willingness to initiate effortful action. Coffee removed a brake that was dampening the dopamine signal that was already there. Adenosine A2A receptors and dopamine D2 receptors sit together on identical neurons in the striatum, physically coupled. When adenosine occupies A2A, it reduces D2 sensitivity, dampening the dopamine signal. When caffeine blocks A2A, D2 sensitivity increases. The dopamine already circulating in the striatum binds more effectively to its receptor because the adenosine that was suppressing the receptor's sensitivity has been blocked. Ferret described this coupling in the Journal of Neurochemistry, confirming that the allosteric interaction modulates receptor affinity. Disinhibition. A suppressor was removed. A signal that was already present became louder because the dampener was silenced. You feel motivated because the dopamine you already had is binding more effectively, not because new dopamine was added. The distinction matters because it reveals the ceiling. Coffee cannot push motivation above the level your existing dopamine supply supports. It can only restore the signal to its undampened baseline. A third cup does not produce 3 times the motivation. It produces diminishing returns because the adenosine receptors most accessible to caffeine are already occupied, and the remaining dopamine signal improvement from blocking additional receptors grows smaller with each additional dose. The ceiling is set by your baseline dopamine supply, and no amount of caffeine can raise the signal above what your dopamine neurons are already producing. Now, tolerance. Why does the first cup stop working? Drink coffee daily and the brain responds to the chronic adenosine blockade by manufacturing more adenosine receptors. More receptors means more binding sites that need to be blocked. The same dose of caffeine blocks a smaller proportion of the expanded receptor population. You need more coffee for the same effect. The baseline without coffee becomes worse than the pre-caffeine baseline because the upregulated receptors, now unblocked, produce stronger drowsiness and weaker dopamine sensitivity than you had before you ever started drinking coffee. Tolerance through receptor upregulation is established in the neuroscience literature. The tolerance arithmetic landed differently once the receptor upregulation reached numbers I could attach to my own morning fog. The first cup of the day for a habitual drinker does not produce above normal alertness. It restores the baseline a non-drinker has naturally. The receptors upregulated overnight while the caffeine cleared. The morning fog that the coffee lifts is partly the fog the coffee habit created through receptor upregulation overnight. The fix and the cause share a molecule, and the cycle perpetuates itself every 24 hours. Stop drinking coffee and the upregulated receptors no longer blocked receive the full force of the adenosine the body produces normally. The headache that arrives 12 to 24 hours after the last cup is the vasodilatory effect of adenosine binding receptors that had been blocked for years, suddenly fully occupied, dilating cerebral blood vessels beyond their normal diameter. The fatigue, the irritability, the difficulty concentrating during the first 3 to 5 days of withdrawal, each symptom is the upregulated receptor population responding to normal adenosine levels with an exaggerated signal because the brain built too many receptors for a world where caffeine was always present. The receptors downregulate over 7 to 12 days, roughly 3 to 4 times longer than the 2 to 3 days the brain needed to upregulate them. The asymmetry explains why quitting feels disproportionate to the benefit. The brain adds receptors quickly when caffeine arrives, but removes them slowly when caffeine stops, producing a withdrawal window that lasts longer and feels worse than the original benefit the coffee provided. The baseline returns to what it was before the habit began. The withdrawal is the brain dismantling the adaptation it no longer needs. Every symptom of caffeine withdrawal is the mirror image of a caffeine effect. The headache mirrors the vasoconstriction caffeine produced. The fatigue mirrors the alertness caffeine provided. The irritability mirrors the mood elevation the dopamine disinhibition sustained. The body built the adaptation symmetrically, and it disassembles it symmetrically. The paradox: if you push through the withdrawal, the alertness you experience on day 14 without coffee is approximately the alertness the first cup of the day was giving you on day 1. The cup was not elevating you above normal. It was restoring you to the normal the habit had suppressed. The non-drinker who never started has the alertness the habitual drinker pays for every morning. Brain adapted to the blockade. The cardiovascular system adapted alongside it, but on a different timeline. Acute caffeine raises systolic blood pressure 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury within 30 minutes. Heart rate may increase 5 to 10 beats per minute. Adenosine is a vasodilator in the peripheral circulation, and blocking it produces vasoconstriction, that fourth power physics that governs every tube in the body, narrowing slightly under the adenosine withdrawal. Chronic drinkers develop cardiovascular tolerance within 1 to 3 weeks, as the upregulated receptors partially compensate for the blockade. The concern applies to intermittent drinkers. If you drink coffee twice a week, you experience the full acute cardiovascular response each time because your receptors never upregulate enough to compensate. A daily drinker's blood pressure may show no measurable caffeine effect because tolerance has fully developed. The same person skipping coffee for 2 weeks and resuming finds the blood pressure response returns at full strength because the receptors downregulated during the break. The cardiovascular tolerance is maintained only by continuous exposure, which is why the health research on coffee produces contradictory results. Studies mix habitual and intermittent drinkers, mixing 2 different cardiovascular physiologies into one dataset. One question remains, the one that settles the argument you have had with your spouse about afternoon coffee. Why does your spouse sleep fine after evening coffee and you do not? C5-1A2, the liver enzyme that metabolizes caffeine. Genetic variation in this single enzyme produces dramatically different half-lives from identical doses. Fast metabolizers, carrying 2 copies of the high-activity gene variant, clear caffeine with a half-life of approximately 4 hours. Slow metabolizers, carrying the reduced activity variant, clear it with a half-life of 6 to 8 hours or longer. Cornelis and colleagues confirmed this genetic variation in JAMA. CEP-ON-A2 genotype determines cardiovascular risk from caffeine intake because slow metabolizers sustain higher circulating concentrations for longer durations. Your spouse who sleeps fine after a 7 o'clock coffee may be a fast metabolizer who cleared 90% of the caffeine by midnight. you lying awake may carry the slow variant that left 50% still circulating at that hour. The argument was never about discipline or willpower or sleep habits. It was about liver enzymes, written into the genome before either of you drank your first cup. A commercially available genetic test can identify which variant you carry, settling the question with data rather than debate. Until then, the practical test is simpler. Track your sleep quality on days with afternoon coffee and days without across 2 weeks in each condition, and compare the morning clarity. If the difference is large, your CP1A2 is telling you something your subjective experience of falling asleep is not. Modifiers shift the clearance rate within any genotype. Smoking induces CY-prone A2 activity, and smokers clear caffeine with a half-life of approximately 3 hours, roughly half the non-smoker rate. Oral contraceptives inhibit the enzyme, doubling the half-life. Pregnancy inhibits it further, tripling the half-life by the 3rd trimester. The same person, the same coffee, different kinetics depending on what else the liver is processing. A woman who drank 2 cups a day before pregnancy with a 5-hour half-life is, by the 3rd trimester, experiencing a 15-hour half-life from an identical dose. The morning cup is still circulating at meaningful concentrations the following morning. The dose did not change. The clearance changed. The clinical guidance to reduce caffeine during pregnancy traces directly to this enzyme inhibition. An identical dose produces higher sustained concentrations because the liver clears it at 1/3 the pre-pregnancy rate. 1 cup. 0 energy added. It contained a molecule shaped like drowsiness that occupied the receptor for drowsiness and let the accumulated tiredness build behind a locked door. 6 systems responded to 1 molecule, each one borrowed, disinhibited, amplified, or compressed, and the receptor count that adjusted to ensure diminishing returns was the only permanent change the molecule left behind. The energy was never in the cup. The cup just hid how tired you already were.